As the title suggests, in this video, we are going to go through the process of removing and installing a pump motor from an Autochlor dish machine. For this video, we're going to use a legacy style A4, A5 type machine, but the process will be pretty similar for all dump and fill machines, with the slight variations on the U34s, but I'll try to address those as we go through the process. For your own time management on this project, you can expect anywhere from about 30 minutes to an hour to take a pump motor out and install a new one. Of course, all that depends on you having all your tools ready to go, the environment that you're in, the type of machine. All those will definitely play a factor in how long it takes to do this process. As with any project you work on, you want to make sure you have all the proper tools. You can see the list here that you will need to remove and install a pump motor. Before you get started removing the motor, go ahead and remove all your tools out of your toolbox. That way you can be much more efficient as the project goes along. The next step is to disconnect the power to the machine. Most cases it will be as simple as unplugging the machine from an outlet. There will be times where the machine is hardwired, so you want to make sure that you follow proper lockout, tagout procedures. The first step you're going to do is focus on removing the electrical connection from the motor to the machine. On a legacy style machine, most of all your work is going to be done in the timer box. On a top mount machine, all your work is going to be done in that top control box. And on a U34, the side electrical box under the main cabinet. Let's get started by removing the timer box cover. Now you can remove the access cover to the power cord connector. This is going to give you access to the ground wire. Now you can access and remove the pump motor ground wire. Normally this will be a 3/8 nut that attaches it to the machine. Now you can remove the neutral wire. On newer machines you'll have a neutral bar, but it could be located also on a neutral post depending on the age of the machine. Next you can move on to removing the hot wire to the pump motor. Usually this is going to be a red wire, or it could be a red and blue stripe, or it can be a black wire in some circumstances. In your full-size machines, this hot wire is going to be connected to your pump motor relay next to your machine hot wire. Here's the location of those wires on a top mount machine. In a U34 machine, all your pump motor wires are going to be located within this electrical control box underneath the cabinet. Go ahead and remove the conduit from your timer box. Just remember, type of machine can dictate the location of this connection. Now that you have disconnected the electrical connection, we're going to move on to the plumbing parts. You're going to have the discharge hose. This might be a good time to replace that discharge hose, especially if it's getting worn or cracked. You also have your intake connection and your fill line connection. If you're working with a legacy style machine, this is probably a good time to put that timer box cover back on just to keep any water from getting into that area. Go ahead and remove your discharge hose. There will be some water in that discharge hose when you pull it away from the motor, so just be ready to take care of that and don't let it get on any electrical connections. Now you can move on to the hard plumbing connections. You have the fill line, which we can remove first. This is a good place to use an adjustable wrench. Try to stay away from a pair of pliers or something that's got serrated teeth. You'll have a much higher tendency to damage those brass nuts. Let's grab your 12-inch pliers. Let's make sure you use the top part for all your pulling. The bottom part has less grip on it. Now we're going to remove the intake connection. Be aware when you take this intake connection off, there will be a metal ring inside here. You don't want to lose that. And all the plumbing connections are disconnected. You can go ahead and remove the pump motor from the dish machine frame. Here's a location of those mounting points. The only difference on the U34, the motor will be turned sideways. Now it can be a tight fit to get these nuts and bolts out, so here's a nut driver and a combination wrench works pretty well. You may also have a couple of nuts and bolts in between the motor and that scrap trap. And these should be 1/2-inch nuts and bolts. I have seen 7/16 used. On this machine we only had 2 nuts and bolts. Ideally you should have 4. Now you can finish separating the plumbing components from the motor. You can start by removing the fill line pipe. Next you can remove the inlet connection from the motor. You can do this by pushing down on the motor and that should separate it from that inlet connection. You are probably going to have some parts come off the machine at this point in time that you don't want to lose. One is the SJ washer. That will be disposable, but you're going to have a compression ring and the compression nut. You want to make sure you hold on to those and don't lose them. Now that everything's disconnected, you should be ready to remove the pump motor from the dish machine. You basically are going to pull the motor over the top of the timer box. It's a pretty tight fit, but a little wiggling, you should be able to make it happen. And of course, if you're working with the top mount machine, this timer box is not going to be in the way and it's going to be a much simpler exit. And of course the U34 is going to be a little tougher just because of the confined space that you're working in. Now you can start the process of taking the components off that bad motor. We're going to start by removing the wiring connection. You're going to access the back plate to the motor. And here's what that connection area looks like. You're going to have 3 wires, your hot, your neutral, and your ground. Sometimes these wires will be connected with the connection nuts, and other times they'll have push-on fittings. Then after you've disconnected the wires from the motor connection, you can go ahead and remove that conduit. Now that you've got that wiring harness removed, we can go ahead and move on to taking off the volute, because we're going to reuse that again on your new motor. You'll have 4 bolts that were taken off, and you're going to use that 9/16 combination wrench. After you have removed your 4 9/16 bolts, now it's going to be time to remove the volute from the old motor. Sometimes the volute will come off with a little bit of persuasion, like a rubber mallet. If you tap on it a few times, it might knock that volute off. Majority of the time that volute is going to need a little bit extra help coming off. So you're going to have to use these backing holes on two sides of the volute. You will find threaded holes. You will reinsert those 9/16 bolts and start screwing them towards the volute. Do them on both sides evenly, and you will see that it will start pushing that volute out. Just keep going. At some point, the volute will easily come off the motor. Now that you have removed the volute, we can start preparing it to be reassembled on your new motor. A lot of times the reason for you replacing a motor is because it's been leaking for quite a while. A lot of times around this edge of your volute will be a lot of rust, so you'll need to get rid of that before we can put it back on the new motor. So using a scrub brush, wire bristles on it is very helpful. Also, like a screwdriver with a flat blade or putty knife or something like that to go around these edges will help get rid of that rust that's going to be accumulated around these edges and make it much smoother. Your goal is to get that edge of rust off the end of that volute. Now you are ready to start assembling your new motor. Typically, this is how it will come from the rebuild. You're going to have to put the wiring harness back on, and you definitely always make sure you have a new gasket, a new O-ring. It's going to be required for proper sealing. One trick to help get that volute back on easily is to make sure that O-ring area is well lubricated. Using the tube lube, or if you're at a restaurant, vegetable oil, something like that, lubricating that O-ring will help greatly to get that volute sealed up as tight as possible. And then you also want to make sure the facing of the volute that goes against that paper gasket is clean as possible. Now you can install the volute back onto your new motor. Just make sure you have the orientation in the right direction, and then start putting on those 9/16 bolts. When you do start tightening on those bolts, you want to make sure that you spread the load evenly across those 4 bolts. Go back and forth between them, but don't just screw one bolt down tightly and move on to the next. Because if you do that, you'll have a greater tendency to pinch that O-ring and you will not get a good seal. And at some point during that tightening process, you should feel the volute kind of pop over that O-ring that's on the motor. And then also you want to make sure that the fitting is super tight. Right there where the gasket meets the motor and the volute, you will not even be able to put your fingernail in between there. If there's any gap at all, you will have a leak. Now you're basically going to reverse the process of when you remove the wiring harness from the motor. So we're going to reinstall the conduit back into the new motor. Another thing you want to check on, if your connections are of the push fit style, you're going to want to really clamp those down and get them tight again before you install it back on the motor. Weak connections are one of the main reasons motors burn up electrically. So now you've got everything reassembled with the wiring harness. Just again, double check all your connections. Make sure they are very tight. Reinstall that protection plate. Now you are ready to put the new motor back on the machine. You're just going to follow the opposite process that you went through taking the motor off the machine. Now you're going to go ahead and start connecting your plumbing connections to the motor. Remember these parts from your intake? This is the old SJ washer. You do not want to use that again. You will not get a good seal if you try to reuse that old SJ washer. Here's what a new SJ washer looks like. As you can see, there are two sizes. The small size belongs on a U34. The large size, which is the 1250, part number 648, that's the one you want to use on this install. And you can go ahead and put your fittings on that intake connection. Just make sure you put it in the right order. It's going to be the nut, that metal washer, and then your new SJ washer. When you fit the motor on, you're going to want to slide it up into that intake fitting where it seats pretty firmly, and then now you can put your fill line in also. Do be careful on that fill line. Those threads are very fine, and so when you put that nut on there, you want to make sure you get a good fitting and don't cross thread that nut. I do recommend putting that fill line connection on first, and then hand tight is good to get you started. Now you can go ahead and line up the rest of the motor to fit that intake connection. You want to push that motor up into that pipe. Now that you have those fittings snug tight by hand, go ahead and finish up the job using your wrenches. Again, just be aware of cross-threading that nut. It's got very fine threads on it, so if you see any brass filings coming off that, stop what you're doing and readjust that fitting. And then go ahead and make sure your intake nut is secure, nice and tight with your new SJ washer, and that should seal up all your plumbing fittings. Now you can attach the pump motor to the dishwasher frame. Again, I had a minimum of 2 nuts and bolts for this particular machine, but I'd recommend all 4 nuts and bolts to securely get that motor attached to the machine. When you're installing that motor to the machine, this is a great place to have a nut driver available. It's pretty tight fit back in there, especially if you're putting it up against a scrap trap, and so that's very helpful to have that nut driver. At this point in time, your motor should be firmly secured on your dish machine. Now you can go ahead and put that discharge hose back on. Again, just verify that that discharge hose is in good shape, so it's a great time to replace that if it looks worn, brittle, or soft. Finally, we're going to go through connecting the wires back to the machine. Basically, we're going to do it in reverse fashion that we did when we took the wires off. After you have the conduit secured to the timer box, we can go ahead and start installing the wires. We'll first start off with the neutral wire and reattach that to the neutral bar. Again, make sure you got good solid connections. Now you're going to attach the hot wire to the machine. It's very important on this female fitting here that you reestablish a solid connection. Tighten down on that connection as hard as you can. And just remember, on a U34, you're going to just be connecting that red wire to another hot wire, probably by a wire nut. On a full-size machine, it's going back on this pump motor relay. And now finally you can go ahead and connect your ground wire. And after that ground wire's attached, just go ahead and put your cover back on. Make sure that gasket is in place. Now that completes the install of the pump motor machine. Now you just got to reconnect the power to the machine. Turn it on and run it through its operation. Let it fill up with water and just check all your connections. Make sure you don't have any leaks coming from any of your plumbing connections, that the volute has been sealed up well, and you're good to go. Congratulations.